on this episode of Safe Mode, we have a ton to get into around DHS, so let's get right into it. This week's Safe Mode coming right at you. Welcome to Safe Mode. I'm Greg Otto, Editor-in-Chief at CyberScoop. Every week, we break down the most pressing security issues in technology, providing you the knowledge and the tools to stay ahead of the latest threats, while also taking you behind the scenes of the biggest stories in cybersecurity.
An attack is coming.
It's about keeping us safe.
He's just a disgruntled hacker.
She's a super hacker.
Stay alert.
Stay safe.
Stay safe.
This is Safe Mode. Welcome to this episode of Safe Mode. I am your host, Greg Otto, Editor-in-Chief of CyberScoop. In our interview segment this week, we're going to be talking to John Ackerly, the co-founder and CEO of Virtru. John does a lot of work around zero trust and data security. Just coming off the Zero Trust Summit, so we're going to talk about data security and a really interesting story about how 9/11 actually subverted the first ever attempt to craft a national privacy law. But first, talking with Tim Starks, senior reporter from CyberScoop. Tim, you looked very confused about the story about...
It sounds like an interesting segment.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, interesting story from John that you will have to listen further on, but you've been pretty busy yourself this week with all of the things going on at DHS, particularly CISA. Talk to us about CISA having a leader in their cybersecurity mission now being put in place.
Yeah, it seems like the some of the biggest key players in the new Trump administration are starting to fall into place. The newest one is Karen Evans, who is going to be the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity. They decided to make that job title as complicated as
that's a mouthful and sounds really complicated when it's really not all that complicated.
It's really like, okay, it's called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. She's in charge of the cybersecurity part. And Karen is someone who knows DC and knows the federal government. She served in the Bush administration, if I recall correctly. She served in the first Trump administration. She's held a variety of very high-profile jobs on cyber and IT, and she's the kind of person that we talked about going back to like September. We were thinking she was going to be the kind of person who might end up in the Trump administration, and here she is.
Right, and she definitely knows how to pull the levers of government to make cybersecurity things happen, whether that is in a CIO federal landscape of protecting the actual agencies themselves, or more from a cybersecurity policy standpoint that may affect things outside of the federal government.
Yeah, she's got a pretty extensive portfolio on those, like you say, those like kind of jobs, right? She knows how to protect the individual agencies. Is one of her jobs. It's going to be one of her top jobs at CISA. That's one of their big remits, is to protect the federal government networks. I think she probably has experience in sort of the critical infrastructure protection side of things too, that CISA talks about doing from her job at DOE when she was
right.
There.
She spent time at Energy.
Yeah, so at Energy she was sort of there was an office they created a few years back, and she was she might have been the first person, but she was certainly one of the first people to run that office that was very much like the cyber-focused office at Energy that they created.
And then also that means, I guess, that we are getting closer to having a full roster of leadership at DHS, and there was an interesting hearing on Capitol Hill this week talking about how the Cyber Safety Review Board, was kind of put on ice after Salt Typhoon, and that came from Troy Egger. What do you know about Troy?
Not a lot. I think Matt had that story for us, and I read his story.
Right, of course.
But he's a businessman, correctly? IBM is where he was, yeah. So it was interesting. If you're thinking about what the CSRB is supposed to be about, you could see a world where maybe he would have been on the receiving end potentially of what they study, depending on how things go for IBM. I mean, obviously Microsoft has been on the receiving end of the scrutiny of that board. We were going to see more of it with the telecommunications companies, potentially with Salt Typhoon. Don't know now, because
right.
because his answer was, it was a great thing to purge that board. They were moving in the wrong direction, and I don't think that's a consensus out there in the world. That's a different view than a lot of other people have. But that's where they're going.
So speaking of some of the other mechanisms that CISA, the office, is in charge of and works with, we are talking also about CISA the bill, the
Yeah.
information sharing bill of 2015. I know that you wrote a story this week that looked at the renewal of that bill. It is coming up for renewal, and you talked to some of the power players over what the future lies with that. What do we have going on?
Yeah, it's a mystery where that's going to end up, honestly. The people who are in favor of it are optimistic that that's going to happen. That it's going to be renewed. It expires at the end of September, which is a weird time frame for when bills typically, when laws typically expire. Um, they put a sunset clause in it in 2015 for 10 years, which is also pretty wild for Congress to do. But the people, the people who are advocates say, look, this thing is really important. It gives us this legal framework to be able to share, not just with the government, but to share with other companies, because there's antitrust exemptions and things like that. Um, the the safeguards they get from that, they say this is really important for us to be able to continue to innovate and come up with new information sharing programs. At the same time, I wrote about that bill back
Right.
when it was just a twinkle in the eye of Senator Collins and Senator Lieberman.
Okay.
So to give a sense of how long ago this was.
Right.
And it was hard. It took years and years for them to get to the point where they were going to develop it and turn it into what it eventually became. So they're now operating with, what is that? It's end of February now, 6 months-ish. That's not a lot of time to get this done. So, it's possible you could see something where they just do a short-term extension, but at the same time, they're opponents of this stuff. Rand Paul, who's now the head of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, was a big opponent of this bill in 2015. So is he going to be interested in speeding that along? Could be tough.
Right. And I think really the key thing to hone in on there is people that care about this bill, like this bill, particularly for the safeguards that it provides private industry. I know there's been tons and tons of coverage in this area. If you read CyberScoop, you've definitely read stories about the automatic indicator sharing program over the years, and there's lots of conversations about whether or not that has been viable. But I think the big thing that people have agreed upon as a positive for this bill is that the safeguards needed in order to share information to make sure that there's not suits for doing so in the event of a cyber incident.
Exactly. And it is when I started reporting the story, I thought, why are people suddenly calling for this to be renewed? The automated indicator sharing program has had a lot of problems.
Right.
It has, you can count the number of people who use it in the hundreds. Although, maybe with the ISACs that are members, they might distribute that to lots and lots of companies. It's still probably not what people expected when they thought, oh, we're going to pass this big Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. And then, as I kept talking to people, people pointed out it's not just that. It's not just AIS. It's the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative that people who are participants in that sign a legal agreement that uses the 2015 CISA law as a basis. So it is much more about the protections in that specific program.
Do you get the sense moving forward that with the renewal, you're going to see some refinements? And if we are, where do you think those refinements are going to be?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I think, if you're looking at what the law was for and what it's accomplished, you can point to some things that it's done successfully. If you're looking at how to make it a little bit more relevant to 2025, there's some things. I mean, there's some ambiguities in the law. Kimball Walden, who was the former lawyer at CISA and later became the acting national cyber director, said this doesn't protect you for sharing cyber threat indicators related to cyber fraud or scams. It seems like a kind of a big oversight, maybe.
Yes.
And then there's a little bit more of I think a far-reaching, maybe not as realistic. I don't know. We'll see. But Larry Clinton from the Internet Security Alliance says we need to update it to deal with things like CrowdStrike outage last year, or the SolarWinds thing, where massive companies that have products that are almost everywhere, might have a failure. And so
Right.
his idea, and I don't know how viable it is let's have them go to the sector risk management agencies that they deal with, or potentially CISA, and say, get a review of what security measures they have and what they don't, and then provide them some kind of to pay for the government might actually pay for the fixes they're told to put in
Yes, we
place.
talked about this internally, and I'll just
Yeah.
say for any of the listeners, I would put strictly my professional opinion on this is I do not agree with that. I was a little bit more flavorful in my language in the way I talked about it in the newsroom, but that is something that is on the table. We'll just put it that way.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if they don't try to do something related to that. Whether it's actually like actual money out of pocket for taxpayers to pay for that, I don't know. But perhaps some kind of additional liability shield. That seems like, if you're matching it with what 2015 CISA was about, that's this, right? You have this liability protection part of things that the law was supposed to do. And so if you want to do that part of it, I think that's probably less pie in the sky.
Great. Tim, always appreciate your work. I know you're on top of it and will continue to be on top of it for our listeners and readers.
I'll do my best.
Thank you. Joining us now in our interview segment is John Ackerly, the co-founder and CEO of Virtru. John has been a veteran of this area for 20 to 25 years. And in this conversation, we talk about all sorts of things, including zero trust, data protection, interoperability, and some work that he's been doing with the federal government, especially on the defense side. And then John puts on his history cap talking about how he was actually in an effort to establish a national privacy bill that actually went by the wayside due to the 9/11 attacks. Check it out. Okay, and joining us for this week's interview session on Safe Mode is John Ackerly, the co-founder and CEO of Virtru. John, thanks for joining us.
So then it is a real pleasure to be here.
Especially in our new digs. We got lights.
I mean, it's very
nice
professional.
mics. Hey, we're
And by the way, on the 14th
good.
floor, I didn't know that was possible in Washington, D.C. You guys
Right?
are living high.
Nice little penthouse we have going here and
Yes,
making sure
indeed.
that we still follow home rule. God forbid that anything goes above that Washington Monument. So we're nice and comfy, but we're high atop D.C., very comfortable and very glad that you're joining us.
Yes.
So, John, you and I have been talking a lot lately, especially with your background in doing what you do at Virtru, but you've spent time on both the public sector and the private sector side of cybersecurity here in Washington, D.C. And there's been a lot of talk recently about starting up the conversation around a federal data privacy bill. And I know that you have spent time doing that at prior stops in your career. And there's a very interesting story going back almost 20 years at this point that we nearly had a data privacy bill back in like the turn of the century. So I'll take it.
Thank you for aging me. In fact, it was 25 years ago.
I will let you take it away from there because it really is interesting. I think our listeners will love to hear it.
Well, it has the benefit of being true, and it's interesting going back to my journals just to make sure that my mind's eye hadn't shifted over 2.5 decades. But the long story short is on 9/11, 7:30 a.m., West Wing, I was part of the National Economic Southern Council staff responsible for technology policy coordination. One of the issues that we talked a lot about on the campaign trail, and this was during the days really going back of the debate over the Clipper chip, was that there should not be backdoors in the 2000 Republican platform. There was an explicit call out for that. And as part of an ethos of putting the individual and privacy first, we also made a commitment that we would have federal privacy legislation. And the first 100 days, a lot was going on. So we did No Child Left Behind and the tax bill, and we prepped Southern legislation that would have required opt-in consent before data could be shared with third parties. And at 7:30 a.m., briefed the Deputy Chief of Staff, a guy named Barry Jackson, about the briefing we were going to have in the Oval a couple of days to put the final Southern touches on that and to send it to Capitol Hill. Fast forward an hour and a half, we had people coming into our office that said, so then ladies, take off your high heels, just get out, because a lot of us weren't part of the really important group that were put 50 feet under the ground. We were told to go to Lafayette Square. So the world obviously changed with dramatic ramifications ever since, including the focus stopped being on privacy, right? It was first and foremost okay, how do we deal with this issue? And actually, I saw both sides of the coin.
Okay.
One is that the federal privacy bill didn't happen, and I was kind of in the room and trying to do what I could as the Patriot Act came through, which, there was a lot going on in that bill, a lot coming from DOJ
Right.
and law enforcement. And the result of that, this is before the cloud, this is before Gmail, is that people who did not have real need to know over data would have access to a lot of information. And then on the flip side of that, data where there was a real need to know was not being shared, specifically in the context of finding the bad guys that were being trained on how to then fly planes. We knew that they were in the country, and other people knew that they were trying to fly planes, and this data was really stuck in networks, was not being shared. There were some institutional issues, but it was also really a technology issue. So I felt firsthand the kind of dual threat of actually not having real control over information as it's being shared. Data that needed to be shared wasn't, and data that probably didn't need to be accessed by third parties was.
So with that, what did you see when you were getting ready to prepare that legislation that has remained similar in the fights that we've had in the 2 decades since that need to go into a national bill?
Yeah, so it's a very different world in terms of the amount of data, the scale of data. The cloud did not exist. And so the notion of having opt-in consent just for sharing data, that's out the window. I still think you can look to the California Privacy Rights Act as a good baseline for that kind of legislation. But I think the more important point on the positive side, right, is fast forward to today, and you can actually deploy technology that actually kind of gets you the cryptographic and the technical means to actually have data, so then data lineage and control over information. So I still think it's very important to have federal privacy legislation, but we're also not beholden to that in terms of organizations, government agencies, people being able to take action. Because I think the prospects today of a privacy bill are pretty low given everything that is going on. So we shouldn't wait for that to happen.
Okay. So with data security, I know that you and Virtru have been doing a lot of work in this space, particularly on both, I shouldn't say particularly, both on the public and private side in terms of really protecting data. And I know listeners of the podcast just heard last week we had our Zero Trust Summit, and we had some of our speakers from the summit on the podcast and talking about really how Zero Trust can be integrated inside the government and how your product really helps do that, but also helps on the privacy side of things. Can you talk about the work that you're doing there?
For sure. And kudos to then John Kindervag, actually back in like 2014, 15. It was funny. So we met. I'm like, it's not Zero Trust, it's verifiable trust. But guess what? We are now on the Zero Trust bandwagon,
right?
And there's a data pillar that is a part of the DoD architecture. That is a load-bearing pillar. So data centricity is very much, central to a Zero Trust architecture, really alongside identity. So if you're an organization that wants to move fast to kind of move on that journey, yes. So the network segmentation is important, yes, endpoint. But you actually get a lot of the job done if you sort out your identity management. And if you actually tag your data, discover it, tag it, understand where it is. Going back in time, I had a view on the problem set from my time in the White House and post, and also when CALEA was expanded, and I know that we'll get to that, but back in 2004. But it was really my brother Will Ackerly, who is the technical beautiful mind, who actually came up with the approach while he was at the NSA. Very bad branding. It was for he wrote a paper for the Galileo Award that talked about the black cloud and the trusted sharing format, which is now the trusted data format.
Okay.
But it really was going back to that use case around data not being shared that should. It's how do you tag data? How do you have a common open standard to bind assertions to data that ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that data? And so that was 2009. That is still going pretty far back. 2012, it was adopted as a standard by the ODNI. Today, it's the 5i Allied Communication Protocol standard for that data wrapper, also adopted by NATO, and we'll see some cool announcements as well coming from the U.S. government along those lines. So finally, there is an open standard. There's an open source project really around the critical piece, which is, okay, how do we really separate the infrastructure layer and having to trust a third party with kind of having the right controls over my networks or over my infrastructure to make sure that like signing keys aren't being owned in the case of Microsoft, or that there aren't backdoors in the case of some of these telecom networks. How do you do that? Well, you definitely have to sort out identity to make sure that the right systems, non-person entities, and people can access data. And you better have your data tagged so that it can move and be shared. And so we really are seeing pretty incredible growth on the part of the DoD and IC side, because really kudos to a lot of the work done over really the past 8 years on this.
Okay.
Where data centricity, if you look at what is coming out, that is like the centerpiece of the zero trust strategy. And there have been attempts at this over time. You've probably heard of JADC2, et cetera. But actually, they are finally making progress here. And it's not just a Virtru thing. It's an approach. It's a new architectural approach to then security.
Yes, the JADC2, I'm putting on my DefenseScoop hat here, the JADC2, and with the data part of it, that is tied into Project Olympus, I believe. Is that the name of the project, or am I confusing
So
that?
then Project Olympus, also known as Bold Quest.
Okay, lots of names.
That is
all right.
lots of gobbledygook. In
it's
terms of
the
naming.
DoD. I mean,
it is the DoD. That is related but different. That
Okay.
is really like the wars of the future are going to be fought with our allies. Even if certain people may not like it, that is going to be the reality, particularly versus China. How do you become more operationally effective to be able to share data at speed, whether it is from an analytics system to someone who has to track down a bad guy, like fully automated, or if it's as simple as sending an email or making sure that data is not overclassified. Literally 50 million man hours are wasted trying to get access to overclassified information. $20 billion is spent in these use cases on maintaining a bunch of networks as the mechanism to share data. Go back to the September 11th use case, right? How do you collapse networks, move the control from the infrastructure to the data? That's what Project Olympus is really driving at. That is a project with, at this point, almost all of our critical allies, Japan, UK, Australia, et cetera, and they've really bought into this data-centric architecture as the future. Just one anecdote, which goes down to from the 50 million, so the man hours down to maybe it was 6 man hours, but it was just 2023 when a special forces operator was trying to help figure out what happened during a tragedy off the coast of Japan where 8 people died in a training exercise.
Okay.
And he was trying to get information from a coalition network called Centrix into our secret network. Had to send many emails to say, hey, are you getting this? Is it coming through? Those emails weren't coming through. Had to use a personal cell phone. Had to type emails that he had already sent on one system to move it over to another system. That is not just a hassle when it comes to those environments. These are very well-trained people. It hurts their focus. It hurts their effectiveness. It raises stress.
I was going to say, just operationally, that's not the way you want to be able to do your job.
And that's that is what we're fixing today. But if a war happened today, imagine that at scale. That is still state of the art. So we are racing to fix that problem. But it's a massive issue, and it's a really important issue from an enterprise context. But it is a life and death issue in these contexts. And oh, by the way, if you move to a data-centric approach, you also solve that insider threat problem, because you aren't beholden to having giving control based on the identity of a person to a system. You can really map all that up with the tags on the data itself, and with a real focus, which is smart, on efficiency. You can also take out literally billions of cost over time.
Can we dial in on that? Because I hear these stories and I think about it in terms of tagging the data and the identity part of it, and I think to everybody that is managing Active Directory or filling your identity management system, I would imagine that that probably has to work with the data at some point too. So can you dive into like, how do we separate, how does focusing on the data side of it remove the hurdles of the identity side, when I feel like somewhere along the way, everybody's going to interact with some sort of identity management program?
Yeah, it's a great question. It does not remove the hurdles from the identity side. You can leverage whatever systems you have in place already.
Okay.
There are a bunch of great companies from Ping to SailPoint to Okta, et cetera, that all do this. And then there are companies that really focus on fine-grained entitlements, where just because you have a top secret tag as an entity doesn't mean that that tag is actually good. Like, have you gone through the proper training? Is it for the right project, et cetera? So we leverage we Virtru, but just generally leveraging existing identity systems. In the context of our commercial SaaS business, we leverage OAuth, Google, Microsoft, et cetera. So you don't have to create a new account or a new password. It just kind of seamlessly works. So for people who've already invested a ton in identity, you don't have to redo anything. You just have to kind of put this important Lego piece into that system.
Okay, so then from an architecture standpoint, it really does get to the heart of Zero Trust then, because you're not redoing anything. You're just adding another layer on top of the data that you're already using and already moving through your network.
It is really integrating. On the one side, it's discovering data, tagging data, which we do, but we also leverage third-party tags, whether it comes from a DSPM provider or whether it comes from more legacy data classification vendors. We do some of that. So it's really about evangelizing this new architecture, right? And obviously, a bigger, the more that the architecture is adopted, it's good for us. But it's not just about us. It really is about expanding the pie.
Right. I was going to ask, like, what are the other hurdles that you've heard from, whether it's on the public sector side or the private sector side, if or organizations want to fully embrace this?
There are two.
Okay.
One is it took us a long time to raise our Series A.
Okay.
In part because doing this is hard in the first couple of years. So my girlfriend, now wife, was like, "What have you done? You left New York." So I left government, went to private, and was really starting this business from a pile of dirt in a recently deceased grandmother's basement. It was like, what? And the issue was people had put us in the encryption bucket, and so many of these companies have failed over time because the user experience doesn't really live up to it, and the underlying architecture is really limited to one or two different use cases. So they're kind of more point solutions. And so we were kind of dragged down by that. And there were other vendors that raised a ton of money, 200, 300 million bucks, which was a lot of money back in 2014, 2015. Now it's like whatever. But they went into some of the big banks, got big POCs going, promised to do everything all at once, and it was just too heavyweight, and it failed, right? So we've just taken over time, brick by brick, methodically building the business and building the workflows with best-in-class design and user experience. So whatever someone touches, it just works. So it, in the early days for us, it really was, and we're still known in like many quarters as like, oh, that's the email security company, right? So that's where we started, and then we moved to files, and then application integrations. Now, we do all of that, but it's in this kind of new world. People talk about AI, but it's really machine learning, analytics, and some of these amazing new capabilities. It's that, right? These systems have an insatiable appetite for data. In the DoD side, there's very sensitive data, NP and C data, et cetera, that these systems can't have access to. We enable that access, right? It's the same thing as then sharing an email, right? You tag it, you put it into a system, you make sure in this case that a non-person entity only has access to, it's a lot more data, to the right things.
I was going to ask,
it's so important philosophically, don't overpromise. Be patient.
Okay. I was going to ask whether the volumes of data that come with generative AI and all of the next level technology that we see, whether that complicates things at all. I would imagine that it doesn't, but I mean, I'm not an engineer.
It does.
Okay, see, there we go.
Totally does.
Okay, so let's...
Which is why we started this in 2019.
Right, so
So this new wave of the kind of our data security platform, we really had to sort of build a new set of services the right way. And the good news too is that the open source community has also advanced over this time.
Okay.
And so whether it's Apache Spark or Istio or these services, NiFi processor, like all that stuff didn't exist with the same kind of robustness back in 2015, 2016. So the world is now here. The tech ecosystem is here to actually make data-centric security work at scale, which is super exciting.
Okay. So I know you just talked about how people think of you as an encryption company, and you're not an encryption company, but I have an encryption question for you. So I'm setting you up here.
Away.
So, yeah, sorry.
By the way, totally reserve the right to be like, hey, talk to Will Ackerly. But
that's totally fine.
I'll give it my very best shot.
No, we just saw over the past couple of weeks Apple pull out of UK due to the UK government wanting access beyond what Apple's encryption has, and Apple said, no, we're not doing that. And I know that's really from a consumer standpoint, but what do you think the lessons are with the way that the government interacts with companies and what they can promise in ways of encryption or what they can't, and really guard against privacy, or really keep in mind what needs to be done in order to be considered privacy friendly, I guess? Yeah,
I mean, that is a good question, just to unpack that a bit. Talk about overreach by the UK government. And I love UK Stratcom and the UK. So this is not like a blast at all of the UK government, but what were they thinking? Like, at the end of the day, this was such a massive overreach. And of course, Apple's going to pull out. I mean, it's their number one value prop, or in my mind, number one. It's a very important.
I mean, we've seen the Super Bowl commercial. They have Super Bowl commercials dedicated to privacy. I mean, it's a thing. It's their thing, right?
Yeah, and if from a security perspective, have they not been reading the news about how even the FBI here has sort of backed off a push for backdoors and to use apps like Signal?
Right, especially in the wake of Salt Typhoon, right?
In the wake of Salt Typhoon. Now, I think they still caveat it, around responsibly managed,
But even going back to what you were saying,
only VIPs maybe would want. But the debate over end-to-end encryption is over. It is done and dusted.
I was going to say the responsible management of it. It goes back to what you were saying with the Clipper chip. Wasn't that the conversations the Clipper chip in the '90s when I was a kid? I mean, I've followed it enough to know that that's basically been the crux of this argument for the past 25, 30 years. It's the key management, and we'll be smart about how we use it. And it's always come out to be like, no, that's generally not the way this works. If you create the backdoor, somebody's going to get into it no matter what.
Yeah, and the very sophisticated, so the nation state actors have proven to be unbelievably effective.
Right.
At kind of getting in through whatever crevice they can. And certainly that's a big old door that they'll be able to walk through. And so, yeah, I just think it was a complete own goal by the UK government. Apple did the right thing. I don't know what else to say about it. I mean, it's just, and I think, if you look at over time from a national security perspective in the U.S., we've always been consistent about this as well. If you look at DoD in particular, never been supportive of backdoors because they've understood this, and the NSA, same deal.
Right.
It's really come from law enforcement. And there are other tools of the trade to find bad guys.
Great. John, really appreciate you coming in the studio, chatting with us for a little bit.
Anytime.
Great conversation.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Safe Mode, a weekly podcast on cybersecurity and digital privacy brought to you by CyberScoop. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and a review and share it with your friends, your coworkers, your CISOs, your sysadmins, your mom, your dad, anybody that wants to know more about cybersecurity. To find out more information or to contact me, please look for all of our social media handles or visit cyberscoop.com. Thanks for listening. Check us out next week.